the ACCC has found that prices are not excessive, and I just am keen to understand that.
It's quite a complex issue because, as you would realise, supermarkets typically carry anywhere between 25 and 30,000 different product lines, and the margins on those vary anything from 10% to for some of the essentials, through to 40 or 50% for some of the luxury items that they might carry. And so in a typical basket, you can understand that there's a range of those products, and getting to the bottom of whether those margins are excessive or not is a very complicated piece. We focused on finding ways to improve competition because, of course, that's the best preventative, if you like, to make sure margins aren't excessive, and that's where our focus has been in this inquiry.
To pick up on your point about the margins of they're between 10% and 50%, what is a fair margin?
Well, that's exactly the challenge. That's a very difficult question to answer, and if you want to go down the track of price regulation, then it becomes a very complex issue. So we don't think that's the way to go. We think a better way to go is to enhance competition, because that means allowing consumers to better understand pricing, to look at true value and understand where the best bang for their bucks is, and get some of that confusion that exists at the moment out of the system is the best way to make sure those margins aren't excessive, because they will have to compete to attract that consumer dollar more.
And in terms of those margins, your report found that they've increased over the past 5 financial years. So is this price gouging for some items?
Price gouging's very much an issue that people talk about, but is ill-defined. What we found is that the supermarkets have been able to steadily increase their margins over the last 5 years, and that's a reflection of their power in the market. They're such strong presence in the market that they can, for example, require their suppliers to fund promotions, to fund a whole range of things, and supermarkets retain their margins even when prices are increasing. That's where our focus has been, and finding ways to address that and make that more transparent, we think will help.
And just one more on the margins point. When those items have a margin of 50%, what sort of items are we talking about here?
You're probably talking more about things like luxury items, discretionary spending on chocolate bars, on those sorts of products where those margins can prevail because consumers are making impulsive decisions about them. And also the pricing of those tends to change almost on a weekly basis. So it's very difficult. For example, chocolate bars, we saw examples where chocolate bars double and then halve in price week in, week out. And so consumers find it very difficult to know what the actual price should be and where the value lies, and therefore they make impulsive purchasing decisions, and that's where those margins come into play.
Commissioner, there's definitely a sentiment in the community that there is a duopoly when it comes to the major supermarkets, yet that's not a term that you've used, instead looking for other terms. I'm just curious about why that is.
Well, we certainly recognise the importance of Aldi as the third player in the marketplace, albeit Aldi has a limited range, around 2,000 product lines, and most of them are home brand products rather than competition directly for the major branded products that consumers are most familiar with. They're also limited in terms of their geographic extent. They're mainly in the major population centres. So it's not strictly a duopoly. There is competition there. There is also some competition from specialist retailers, butchers, greengrocers, and also some of the other retail chains, for example, Chemist Warehouse, Bunnings, etc., are starting to carry some of the products that supermarkets also carry. So there is some competition at the margins, but consumers told us very strongly that the number one factor they consider in making their purchasing decisions is convenience. In other words, the location of the nearest supermarket and the ability to do their shopping all in one go. And that's the particular strength that the two majors have. So we recognise that it's an oligopoly rather than a duopoly, but there is still significant market power held by the two major players.
When it comes to shrinkflation, this is something that you've focused on and has come up regularly, and including in political discussions in recent years. Why is it so hard just to define exactly what shrinkflation is and what it looks like?
Well, it's not hard to define it. It's where the product size changes adversely for the consumer without a resulting change in price. What we think is important is that consumers are alerted to that, and that's the recommendation we've made here, that there's a requirement to actually indicate on the shelf where a product has gone through that shrinkflation and therefore is less value for consumers. We think that's the best way to address that issue.
And tell me, what do you think needs to happen around pricing data, and how would that work in practicality? Are there parallels to petrol pricing, for example?
There are. We've recommended that Woolworths and Coles in particular, but eventually Aldi as well, be required to make that pricing available in real time via application programming interfaces, by APIs. That would enable third-party comparators, for example, to provide consumers with an app that would allow them to compare prices in real times between the two major supermarkets, for example, and also look at how that price has changed historically. And that would give much more information to consumers to be able to make sensible purchasing decisions, even when there's all the confusion created by all the promotions, all the specials, all the different coloured tickets as they walk down the aisles.
The Prime Minister earlier this year, in relation to closing the gap, had a big focus on food security in remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. That comes up throughout your report, and referencing, in fact, a lot of that work done by the government and the National Indigenous Australians Agency. What did you find specifically about food security in remote communities, and what are you calling for?
Well, it is a particular challenge in those communities, and for a whole range of reasons. The fact that in small communities there can't be competition, the logistics of getting food, and particularly fresh food, to those locations is very complex. We did find some problems that were identified for us. For example, supermarkets adopting the practice of not putting pricing on their shelves. That makes it very difficult for consumers. They only get information about the pricing when they're at the checkout, and of course they're less inclined to change products at that point in time. So we've made some recommendations around pricing, but we've also recognised that in terms of addressing food security, it's likely to need government intervention, support for example, community-owned stores, and some of the measures the government's already introduced, for example, to try and address the imbalance in price between, for example, remote locations and more populous centres.
And just finally, the federal government has had this report for a month. We've seen in principle support and a particular focus on some areas, but not a full-throated support and saying that all of the recommendations will be adopted. How do you react to that?
Well, that's a decision for government. We're a regulator. We're tasked with doing the inquiry. We make some recommendations. It's really up to governments whether and when they adopt those recommendations. So we're not surprised by that.